Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Originally, I wanted to have today's guest on to talk about woke and what's going on with the social justice movement, but events on the ground have led us to decide we're going to have a different discussion. We're going to discuss what's going on in Israel and the response of some of the libertarian thinkers in America, and we're just going to dive right in. To be honest, I have nothing prepared because I prepared for the other thing, but a freewheeling discussion can be beneficial, I think. Well, today's guest is Max Borders. He's the founder and executive director of Social Evolution. Wow, it stepped on my tongue today, I guess. It's a nonprofit dedicated to liberating humanity through innovation. He's also the author of numerous books and articles, including Underthrow, How Jefferson's Dangerous Idea Will Spark a New Revolution. Max Borders, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
All right, so I guess first, what happened? Let's get a quick review of the events of the last few days of what took place in Israel.
Well, I think, I think we can spin all manner of theories about what happened behind the scenes, starting with, with the history of Israel going back to, the manifesto of Jewish nationalism and all the way up. And I think those are historical points that are worth talking about, particularly among people who were better educated on it. However, I think to answer your question, what we need to do is just process what we're seeing. And what we're seeing is, thankfully, even though it's very, very difficult to look at, is both the perspective of the people, the Israelis, and the perspective of Hamas, who was recording a lot of this in order to celebrate the gore and the massacre and the rape and so on. That being said, I think what we have is an isolated thing, not talking about history, not talking about the deep state, not talking about other kind of motivations and theories and this and that, is we had an invasion by Hamas, which started as a terror group, and I think 1988 was their charter document. Moving forward in time, they've participated in a lot of terrorist violence, and now you have a situation where they were able to penetrate the border through all manner of means, tunnels, coming over the walls with hang gliders, breaking through the barriers. As I understand it, there is a very sensitive sensor system along these borders that should have activated the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, and that didn't exactly work, or something happened. A lot of people have conspiracy theories about that, but in essence, the IDF and the defense apparatus of the Israelis they were asleep at the switch. Hamas, ready to bathe in blood, happy that they were able to penetrate to the degree they did, got in and massacred a whole bunch of people, raped and all like that. And there are pictures of it that are very difficult in my mind to deep fake everywhere. Now, after that horror show, and we got a lot of what you would call on this side of the pond comeuppance talk, right? So basically, that innocent Israeli teenagers and babies and girls and old people, Holocaust victims, deserved it in some way. This is the disease of collectivism in the mind, in my opinion. And yet these kind of conflicts certainly make people collectivist in their thinking. You apply the fallacy of hypostatization strategically, but also naturally in times when your people versus the other happens. And in this case, it definitely happened, and it was horrific. Now, on this side of the pond in the United States and all around the world, it's not the Richard Spencer's, the neo-Nazis that came out of the woodwork to cheer this on. It was the radical left and the dispassionate observer type libertarians who think in terms of abstraction and numbers. Well, you know, the retaliation of the Israelis on the last instance was disproportional and this and that, and they try to make some kind of rational case that would somehow justify this level of barbarism. But in any case, I'm starting to betray my biases in relating the story as it is up to this point. But my biases are not for terrorism, never have been, and so maybe we can start there.
Okay, I'm going to tell you my biases or my starting position is this. I don't think the government of Israel is an ideal government from my perspective. Neither is the United States government by any stretch of the imagination. I also am opposed to foreign aid coming from the United States, not just to Israel, but to anybody. I don't think that the United States should be funding wars. I don't think we should be sending troops. That's not what I think we should be doing.
Agreed.
Okay. That being said, I think there's a tendency in the libertarians, and there's a lot of people out there that I understand this type of infighting or disagreements. It's just like, who the hell cares? You know, anarcho-capitalists, utilitarian libertarians, natural right libertarians, they just like, what the hell are you even talking about? But to me, I have been heavily influenced by the likes of John Locke, Adam Smith, Lysander Spooner, Frederick Bastiat, Ludwig von Mises, Ayn Rand. I have called myself a libertarian, small L, for the past, I don't know, almost 25 years, right? I've stopped that because I do not want to be mistaken for somebody that is going to draw a moral equivalence between Hamas and Israel. It's almost to me like the quote in the Bible where Jesus says something to the effect of, once you've thought of a sin in your mind, you've already committed it, or he who is not sin cast the first stone, basically equating all moral failings. And that is, to me, a huge mistake. You ultimately have on one side of this line a democratic country that lives by basically civilized rules. I get it. They have conscription. They've got a lot of socialist policies that I would disagree with. But ultimately, they're a modern state. They show incredible restraint in these wars with the Palestinians, who aren't a country. If the Palestinians had the Israeli capabilities, there would be no more Israel. But Israel doesn't do that. They don't wipe out the Palestinians. They always warn civilians, leave, get out of these areas because we're going to bomb them, as opposed to Hamas, who deliberately goes and attacks civilians. So over this, and I realize that this may be a little disconnected. You know, some of my thoughts are scattered a little bit. I apologize for that. But over this last weekend, going through Twitter and Facebook, I came across some quotes from Dave Smith, for instance, who's very prominent within the Libertarian Party. And he says something to the effect of, oh, yeah, you know, all we're going to hear about is the captives, meaning the Israeli captives, implying that we're not going to hear about the Palestinian, civilian deaths, whatever. Through most of these quotes, like I said, there's this drawing of this moral equivalence. Now, I was the spokesperson for the Libertarian Party of Connecticut. I left that position because the Mises Caucus of Alabama put a post on Facebook praising Ted Kaczynski. And I contacted the chairman of the Libertarian Party of Connecticut, and I said, we've got to disavow this. And he said, well, we don't like to get involved. I said, well, then I'm out, because I'm not going to be associated with that. So, you know, I've said a lot, maybe I've said nothing, but given what I've just said, Max, what are your thoughts? Because I saw a post from you yesterday where you said something to the effect of, calm down, people. And the way that I took it was that you were like, you know, I get the theoretical arguments, but this is beyond the pale.
Well, that's essentially what I mean. I think I think what I feel right now, honestly, is a sense of nihilism. And what I'm watching is, in other words, have become, even as I've aged, a little more radical in certain ways. And in my radicalism, I see the way the empire grows, and it grows on the backs of the people. It invents pretexts to justify its existence and grow. And the American imperialism has been stunning, right? So speaking of moral equivalence, this is one of those cases where it's like, I'm not trying to bring about a tu quoque argument, but if you think about Russia invading Ukraine, right, and we get involved in a proxy war, and our justification is we're gonna help the underdog, right? Essentially. And I don't think that that's the reason why we're in Ukraine at all. I think it has to do with a lot of different things. But the expansion of empire, the elimination of Putin has always, I mean, there were people like Victoria Nuland, who's now our Assistant Secretary of State, who was responsible for becoming involved in the coup that brought Zelensky to power. Right? We have her on recording planning this, right, with people in the deep state. And so we have been involved in military adventures since, I mean, on more fingers than I have on both hands. Just since I was born, and I was born in 73. So that starts with Vietnam and it goes forward. And the vast majority of these interventions have been failures, right? And have left a bunch of dead. The proxy wars we've engaged in add even more to that count. And this Ukraine proxy war was shitty now. And yet the vociferous I stand with Ukraine and outcries against the activities, when the United States has essentially been baiting Russia and threatening them with being surrounded on all sides by NATO, when they had an agreement that we broke not to expand Ukraine into NATO because that's too much of a threat.
Well, hold on, Max. What do you mean we broke the agreement not to put Ukraine in NATO? Ukraine's not part of NATO.
I know. That's why, right? There was an agreement. There was an agreement in a past administration between Russia and the United States that there would be no hostility or anything. There would be no problematic stuff going on as long as the United States kept Ukraine out of NATO, right? They then broke that agreement. The United States broke that agreement. And ever since then.
But how, Max? How did they break the agreement if Ukraine's not part of NATO? If they agreed not to make Ukraine part of NATO and they haven't done that, how did they break that agreement?
Because they started trying to get Ukraine into NATO. Actively.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they started actively trying to get Ukraine to join NATO. Now, whatever you think about Putin, he's a scumbag, right? Everybody agrees about that.
Yeah.
But the idea that Putin strategically invades a neighbor to create more of a buffer zone between it and what it perceives as its enemies, and they absolutely are enemies avowed enemies of Russia, right? And orchestrated this coup in pre-Zelensky to install Zelensky, helped orchestrate this coup to get them on a path to joining NATO, right? Strategically, Russia sees this, and I'm getting to a point of going back to this stuff. Mm-hmm. And you strategically, and I'm not saying any country shouldn't be invading other countries on principle. However, when you think in realpolitik or realism, and you have to behave pragmatically, and you compare in tu quoque fashion what the United States has done in terms of interventions around the world, and then act all high and mighty when all of a sudden Russia does it with its neighbor to expand its buffer zones. It's sort of it's kind of rich, if you know what I mean, when you hear all of these people who want to get involved in the Russia-Ukraine conflict and want to support our proxy war with them, to then turn around on this, and it's just staggering. It's like there's no consistency whatsoever. It's absolute team sports. You know, the non-interventionism seems to be dead on the left, and on the right has become more non-interventionist, bizarrely, but it's divided. But here's what I think this conflict did, and I'll stop banging on about this. Here's what this conflict did for the United States. It looked like there were two poles, the red pole and the blue pole, and people are sort of accreting around those poles with some sort of confused independence in between. Confused, or like, you know, we're talking about ordinary people. We're not talking about, you know, the crazy cheerleaders on each end of the distribution curve. We're just talking about ordinary people. We're sort of like, yeah, both parties suck. I guess I have to pick a team, you know, to go vote. And so we have this growing independence movement, independent, not a party, but just people who identify as nonpartisan. But basically everybody else is around these two poles, right? But what this conflict has done, in my opinion, and you may disagree, is cut both of these parties in half. At least it's fracturing them tremendously. And I kind of don't give a shit about the libertarians, because they're kind of numerically irrelevant. And you know, I hate to say that, but it's true. So it's not, their opinions are not where the action is. But when you think about the masses of people, and especially the masses of extremists, they're being cut in half right now on this issue. So now you have there is no distinction between the words of a democratic socialist marching in New York or Washington or Sydney or any other major city in the world, and that of a national socialist. Right? The only difference is that national socialists don't call ordinary people Nazis, because they know they're not.
Yeah.
Right. And so the behavior, what has it brought out is this virulent anti-Semitism on the progressive left, on the let's call it the social justice left. And it is just stunning that people can cheerlead the loss of innocent life. So I can understand there being some people who are trying to be circumspect and play like Switzerland, like Dave Smith, and say, it's just, you know, this is wrong on both sides and whatever. But like, there are power asymmetries with respect to the Israeli Defense Force on the one hand and the Jewish state, and the Palestinian Authority, and therefore also Hamas on the other. However, there are also asymmetries in the degree of depravity that the minority group is willing, the smaller, purportedly weaker group is willing to use, technologically weaker anyway, numbers wise perhaps weaker, is willing to take anyway. There's also an asymmetry there. Sure. Right? So there is this strange double asymmetry, and it's like, yes, to some extent, the way things were set up in 1948 was due to imperial powers, namely Britain, coming in and setting up helping to set up the Jewish state, but they were also like backing out at that point. And they were trying to negotiate agreements. And at some point they installed some really crazy Islamist who fomented a lot of this stuff early on, and it has never stopped. But there's so many historical things that we could go into, and again, I'm not an expert on that, But I would just encourage people to really, really take a look at the Jewish state and who the Palestinians are, where they came from, when all this happened, and understand that the sort of Leviathan mentality that was set up by first by the League of Nations, which became the United Nations in a manner of speaking, and especially the British, and at the time they were still an empire, that this sort of carving up those places, the Jews were always there. And after 1948 became, with this reverse diaspora happened. And so their numbers grew and their power grew, and they got technical assistance from the West to set up the Jewish, a strong Jewish state and military and so on. So it's like, I don't like central imperial authorities. I don't like them. I don't think you do either. And the military industrial complex is like a fungus that you can never get rid of, because sometimes it's justified in its behavior and sometimes it's not justified in its behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's justified in its behavior with respect to Russia, Ukraine. And that was one point of bringing that up earlier.
Okay.
I don't think that proxy war was justified. Yes, we can say Russia did a bad thing and innocent people are dead, but we put fertilizer on Ukrainian dead with that proxy war. What could have been 3,000 dead or 30,000 dead turned into 300,000 dead very quickly because of our proxy war. And they were coming to the table, Ukraine and Russia were coming to the table to set up an agreement, and early on, they flew out the British Prime Minister who scuttled the whole damn thing. And now we're looking at probably 500,000 people dead in Ukraine. So, like, our imperialism gets to be okay in certain contexts, and I think this is why. Well, let me stop there, and I'll get your reaction to all that, because that was a lot. We have a freewheeling conversation, like you said, and I can start to go off in different directions. I don't want to do that.
It's okay. Well, you did say a lot, and I do agree with you that the libertarians are numerically insignificant on this issue. And I agree. And it's been going on beyond this with this sort of weird, I don't know how to say it, but the political landscape has so changed in my lifetime from the conservatives, at least rhetorically in their propaganda, were for small government, states' rights, strong national defense, free trade, interventionist, and the liberals were against free trade, against intervention, for a bigger state, and everything is kind of switched where nothing really fits into that sort of paradigm any longer. But at the same time, we've become more polarized, which is very strange to me. The reason the libertarian thing has such a importance in my mind is because it's just a word, granted, but it's played such a large part in my identity for so long. And to see these comments, I mean, I got into a discussion with one guy on Twitter, and the guy said to me, he said, I'm going to follow Rothbard on this. And he says, Rothbard says that to retaliate against the country, if you're attacked, is okay, unless innocent people are going to die. Then you have no right to do it because the civilian might die. My view of that is so different as to, I don't know how you arrive at that conclusion. If you come to me and punch me in the face and then throw somebody in front of you, so I say, okay, I don't want to hurt that person, I'm going to back off. Then you punch me in the face again. At what point do I say, you know what? He's at fault for using that human shield, not me. I'm going to defend myself. And if Hamas is willing to use human shields and innocent civilians die in an Israeli strike, which I hate to see happen, I'm not for that. But at some point you have to defend yourself, and it's on them that these people die. But the guy I was talking with, he wouldn't allow for that. Not only that, but I'm seeing people on Twitter saying that Hamas are freedom fighters. Like, are you crazy? Even if you came to the conclusion, Max, that Israel is 100% unjust, which I don't, but if that was your conclusion, how do you arrive at the conclusion that Hamas are freedom fighters? It's so absurd to me. So that's where I am now. You mentioned the history, and I don't know. Do you want to? I know a little bit about the history. I don't know if you want to talk about it. I think it's relevant, and it's part of the problem with these discussions. Is there's sort of so many, I guess, antenna going out in different directions that it's hard to condense it into one discussion.
Yeah, I worry I'll risk embarrassing myself, especially if there are scholars on the region out there listening. But I think a couple of maybe bullet points recommend themselves. When there was I think his name was Theodore Herzl, who wrote a book around the turn of the century, just before the turn of the century, about Hebrew sort of nationalism, and reconstituting a state along those lines.
Yes.
There was also, believe it or not, a movement called Christian Zionists, who felt that the Christian Zionists, who were all over the West, were supportive of the idea of a reverse diaspora, of bringing Jews back to that region as a homeland. But I think a lot of people have this mistaken idea that there were just all of these Palestinians, what we call Palestinians now, which is actually the a Western ascription name, right? But there were all these Palestinians already there when all of this started happening. There were some Bedouins, there were some small populations, and basically the whole area was controlled first by the Ottomans and then by the Brits.
Max, hold on 1 second. I'll take you back even further than that.
Because, go for it.
Yeah, because this is the narrative out there, right? So I hate to interrupt, but this drives me batty. The narrative is that the Jews came along and stole the country from the Palestinians.
Right.
There has never, and I challenge anybody listening who disagrees, there has never been a self-governing country called Palestine in the history of this planet. Ever. It was governed by one empire after the other. The Romans governed it. I think then the Byzantines governed it. Then the Ottomans governed it. And then the Brits governed it. So you never had that country.
Exactly.
Never.
You always have had imperial powers around, in and around the region, with Christians and Jews and Muslims all sort of.
Right. Now, you also, there's a book called, I believe it's called Innocents Abroad, written by Mark Twain. And it wasn't a propaganda piece. He was just describing his travels. And he described Palestine basically as a desolate wasteland. Like there's nothing there, right? Nothing at all. So, like you said, there's Jews, there's Arabs, there's Christians living sporadically throughout there. So the Jews decided to migrate there. And they didn't just do it to say one day, well, let's just go to Israel, whatever. They do it because they're being persecuted wherever they are in the world, including in Arab countries, right? So now the Brits after World War I take control and they give 80%. This is important. 80% of what traditionally is Israel. And like you said, I'm not a scholar. I might be a little off on the percentage, so forgive me. A large amount of the area that was traditionally Israel went to Arabs. That's not what we call
and the Arabs said, hell no.
Well, no, they took the 80%. That's Jordan today. Then the rest was going to be divided between Jews and Arabs.
Mm-hmm.
The Arabs said, like you said, hell no. We're not taking that deal. When Israel declares that they're a country, I think the declaration was in 48, but they became a country in 49. It's one of those things where it takes effect. I'm not positive. When that happens, the surrounding Arab countries say, out of your homes, Arabs, because we want you to be safe. We're now going to go and drive the Jews into the ocean, and then you can return to your homes. However, that's not what occurred. They got their asses handed to them by the new Jewish state. That's how you ended up with the diaspora amongst the Palestinians. They ended up on the outskirts. That's the history. That's a fact. That's not.
You're talking about the 48 war?
Yeah, the original war. That's a fact. That's not my opinion. That's not, not only that, but King Hussein of Jordan butchered Palestinians, killed more Palestinians than Jews ever thought of killing. Not only that, but the surrounding Arab countries where Jews lived kicked the Jews out of the country. So that's
ethnically cleansed.
Yes. Now that's the history. Now, how that's relevant to today, in my view, is only in this. To say that the Jews are an occupying force who stole a country is just not accurate. Now, if you want to say they came from Europe and they had no right to there, well, now you're saying that a land belongs to somebody because of their ethnic heritage. And I don't believe that either. And if that's the case, then Jews certainly have a stronger claim because their claim goes back thousands of years.
Right. Israel, was it, I guess, I don't want to screw up my history here again, but the land of Israel in the time of King Solomon, King David, the Maccabees, and so on, was massive. Now, I also agree that you can't wind the clock back 2,000 years and say, okay, we're going to recreate that because they deserve it, right?
No, I agree with
that's stupid. Any more than it's like there is never going to be the end of this reparations narrative in the United States. Both for Native Americans and African Americans. It's like, I understand the impetus, but it's like there can never be enough justice when time passes and new generations come online and they're just here, like,
trying to live.
You can't parse all this stuff, right? So that becomes a very difficult story. But I think we're seeing in very clear terms, and this is it sounds a little autistic, if you forgive me for saying, but it's a good model. It's a good way of lens through which to view these kind of things. That explains, I think, in pretty good measure, the kind of some of the stuff that we're seeing. And think of these as three levers, okay? 3 levers. These 3 levers doesn't mean that you have just one lever. A lot of people have multiple levers at multiple degrees. But the basic 3 levels are: the progressive lever is oppressor, oppressed, right? The libertarian lever is coercion, freedom, okay? And then the conservative lever is civilization, barbarism, okay? Now, depending on how much we are, what we have the strength of one of these dialed up within us for whatever reason, genetics or, socialization, or a combination of the two in vacillating tandem, you're going to have your levers dialed in. And they're not actual levers. This is a metaphor, but you get what I mean. If you're a progressive, you've really got this oppressor oppressed thing dialed way the hell up. And so when you look at the world, you're seeing everything in terms of the lens of oppressor and oppressed. It is the big guys and the underdogs, right? And the underdogs are the marginalized groups, the intersectional groups, right? Then, of course, you can also have your dial of freedom versus coercion dialed way down towards coercion. So to justify this one, you might see, you're starting to see, for example, these progressives become very authoritarian in their outlook. What is more authoritarian than to say, okay, yes, Israel is the Israelis are a bunch of occupiers. First of all, they got the story wrong, I think, to a very great degree. And, the idea that, for example, in the 6-Day War, when, what was it, 69?
67.
When Israel, 67, when Israel took, I guess it was the Golan Heights and some other place, strategically, the idea that they were going to be given that in the west parts of the West Bank, if they were going to give that back, is crazy, because that's what they used to launch an attack on them, right? So you keep that territory as a buffer and retaliate when necessary. But the way a progressive will see that is that's oppression, not retaliation.
Right.
Now, the conservatives did come on after, the conservative Israelis did come on after 67 and really pushed, if I remember correctly, pushed for there to immediately be Jewish settlements in these areas, which should probably have remained sort of like militarized zones in pragmatic terms. But the narrative gets spin, you get the spinning of narratives around this oppressor-oppressed dichotomy. That's the narrative. That's what you're always going to see in every case. The way the social justice, critical social justice types look at the world is everything is oppressor oppressed.
Right.
Until you start creeping in on some of this authoritarian stuff, which is the use of coercion to instantiate your underdog theory, right? And then finally, the conservatives. So I have to admit, when I think about this, I mean, I'm much more libertarian than any of the other two. And in fact, I think that Gandhi is the way to go. Gandhi brought down the British Raj without a shot fired, through satyagraha, through peaceful means. And that is my jam. But I'm here to tell you, if somebody takes a shot at me, I'm shooting back. Right? I'm like a Buddhist warrior monk. We are praying for peace. We're all about ahimsa.
Yeah.
But as soon as someone starts to fight, they're trained. They're badasses.
Right.
They will retaliate. They will fuck you up. That's me right there too. So like, I'm not a pacifist, but I don't. And so if you think of the Israeli state as being an apparatus for retaliation and defense, that to me is justifiable. But I also look at this and I realize that I have some conservative in me, even though I'm a libertarian primary, which is to say, and these are not political designations. These are these psychosocial designations, sure. Right? Because I don't consider myself a libertarian either. It's this much silliness. But there is this idea of civilization versus barbarism. What we saw the other day was absolute barbarism.
Absolutely.
And that barbarism I cannot tolerate. I cannot take it.
Me neither.
And I'm not saying that the Israelis haven't had to be barbaric at times in their retaliation. And I am not saying that there are poor little Palestinian kids who died in some of these so-called surgical strikes. That shit sucks. War is hell. I hate it. I absolutely hate it. But the expectation that the Jews are gonna all stand out and sing Kumbaya while their people are being cut up and burned and raped, it's absolute Bronze Age barbarism.
Right. And you can't negotiate with people
medieval
like that, right?
ideology behind it.
Yeah.
Where your rewards are in heaven, where martyrdom is the ultimate thing that you can do to become a hero. Like there's no reasoning with that.
Nope.
There's no going, oh, peaceful brother, let's talk. Like what the fuck? Excuse my mouth.
That's okay.
So anyway, you see how the three axis model
I do,
works?
and I actually like it. And it reminds me of, ironically, it was a rabbi that told me this. I was having a conversation when I was in prison, maybe, I don't know, 20 something years ago. And he said within Judaism, there's a push to the right where everybody tries to outdo each other as far as how far to the right they'll go. So if you take one position when it comes to the Torah, the next guy comes along and says, oh no, you're not pure enough. You're not extreme enough. And I see that type of thing within, I mean, it applies to the progressives, like you said, everybody's oppressed. Now you have in the social justice movement, this intersectionality where they like have rankings of oppressed, like if you're a white male, you're at the top of the unoppressed list, but maybe you're a white gay male, you're a little oppressed. If you're a white gay female, you're more oppressed. If you're a black female, you're oppressed, but black gay female. And it's like all these things where they just we're going to go more and more to see who's the most oppressed. And I see that same sort of dynamic going on with the libertarians and with the conservatives right now, with like this push to be anti-establishment. Like if you just label something establishment, it's automatically bad and we have to go to the right of it, or to, I don't know if it's to the right, who the hell knows what direction. But I'm seeing posts, for instance, about the Cato Institute, which has been a bedrock for libertarian thought for a long time. And I don't know much, about the inner workings and the politics, but I've heard them referred to, or read them referred to as the establishment libertarians. And the ANCAPs seem to go to the extent now the state's bad. They're opposed to the state. Therefore, anything a state does is bad. Therefore, Israel's bad. Right? It's just like this push to be as extreme as possible, not taking concrete factors or what's actually going on into consideration. This is my worldview. How do I make this fit?
It's really linear and really autistic thinking. It's like, right. I have the NAP, the NAP, right? And I'm going to use it as a cudgel. What is it? The non-aggression axiom, or the non-aggression principle. Yes. I'm going to go around and I'm going to use that as a cudgel, and I'm going to use that as the lens through which I see everything. That's that coercion freedom thing going off the charts into abstraction la land, right? And it's sort of like, if these fools were ever attacked by criminals or whoever, of course there's a natural right. That's, first of all, if you get them to really think about it, it's about not initiating violence. Right. It's not initiation of violence or force. Yeah. And defense and retaliation are implicit in that.
Absolutely. Yes.
Right.
Sir.
So it's like, yes, the Jewish state is unwieldy. It's too big. It's statist. Rah, rah, rah. I agree with that in a lot of ways, but it is what they have. Right. And so the idea that you're comparing this situation to your ideals and end up justifying the level of barbarity that we saw on the part of Hamas is just fucking batshit. It's like your abstractions just don't work in this very warty, strange world we have. It's like, I don't know if we talked about this last time, but I call myself an asymptotic anarchist, and by that I mean, an asymptote is a curve that approaches a line or an axis. And at this point on the axis is absolute freedom and freedom from coercion or coercive states. Then the curve gets closer and closer to it, but it may never actually get there. That's what an asymptote does in math. And I'm not a math person, but I like the metaphor, right? We may never actually get there. It's like, you've got to sprinkle some pragmatism into that. You've got to wrestle with the real world rather than going around with your NAP cudgel hitting everything. Because you're an idiot and all you can think is in autistic abstract terms.
Yeah. Ayn Rand argued that compulsory taxation is immoral, but she also said that has to be the last thing that you argue for on the way to a free society, because she ultimately understood you can go in and say, let's just dismantle everything right now and implement this society. First of all, you're not going to get it done. Secondly, the results aren't going to be great if you do that. But I'm reminded, as you mentioned the word pacifist, of Sam Harris, who's no, right-wing ideologue by any stretch of the imagination. And he made the point that one sociopath armed with a pocket knife could take over a country full of pacifists.
Yeah.
I mean, what are you going to do? Like, if you're not willing to
Ludwig von
yourself,
Mises.
Yes. Yeah.
Ludwig von Mises.
Yeah. No warmonger.
Action
No warmonger.
He's no warmonger, but he says, at a certain point, if the threat is existential, we might have to institute conscription to survive.
Yeah, I wouldn't be for that, by the way, but I get the sentiment, and that I think is what we're
Well,
discussing.
he's a Jew who's coming off the heels of
Yes.
World War II when he
Right.
wrote this.
Yeah.
It's like you can see how the fiercest idealist who goes to the Mont Pelerin Society and looks at all of his buddies and said, "You're all a bunch of socialists," right? Is also going to talk about conscription when it comes right down to it, because if your enemies are an existential threat and we don't have time, say, to have a voluntary force, which I think practically speaking we would, if everybody's like, hell yeah, we got to fight, we're going to die.
Sure.
You don't have to conscript people.
No.
But and we can say Mises was probably wrong on that. However, we can see where he's coming from.
Right.
He has enough pragmatism, enough connection to the real world of the horrors he had just come out of to think in terms of asymptotic anarchism or ordo-liberalism. I don't know if you would consider him an ordo-liberal or
I don't know, Max. You're coming up with these terms.
I don't know. I'd encourage you to look into it. But the long and short of it is, you get these kind of like goofy Rothbardians who just go around like, hating the state, and that's all they know how to do. It's like, if all you know how to do is hate the state, then you talk about individual people, methodological individualists who are in the context of time and space, who have to defend themselves.
Right.
What do you expect them to do? Right. It's like, well, they should, have private security outfits. Or I don't know. It's like,
raise the black flag of anarchy
first. It's sort of like Bertolt Brecht said, first eat, then ethics. It's the same kind of thing. First survive, then create your ideal order. And so I'm torn in my idealism. I am such an idealist, and you know this about me. I'm constantly working towards that anarchist North Star, that anarchism being a set of rules without any central authority or ruler, rules without rulers, where we have eliminated and banished coercion from human society to the degree we can, and decentralized into private voluntary associations.
That is my North Star. You can't get there if you're dead, Max.
But you can't do that if you're dead.
Yeah.
You can't do it if you're dead. And this is what sucks. This is what has left me really nihilist, by the way, is I see the national security state that after 9/11, when, there was some justification for going into Afghanistan, they had the Patriot Act, and they were starting to surveil our own people. The NSA, we were starting to spy on our own population in the interests of security. I knew that was going to come back to bite us in the ass, and it has.
Sure.
Now we have the apparatus of the state surveilling people, claiming before this act, literally claiming that people who follow Trump are domestic terrorists, creating moral equivalency between MAGA people, rednecks in tractor hats, who just want to fly their American flag and be American and get, lower their taxes and create good jobs, right? That those people are domestic terrorists after they got goaded in on January 6th into the Capitol. These same people are creating moral equivalence between that and Hamas.
Right.
Unarmed people show up at the Capitol. Unarmed. No one died except among them. And suddenly they're saying, oh, they're domestic terrorists, they're insurrectionists. They're just fomenting this. And the national security state, the defense, the military industrial complex is now getting turned inward on us. And now we have this, and it rejustifies its existence in a manner of speaking. Why? Because that's all we've got. And that just makes me crazy, man. It makes me feel so dark, because I know that national security state needs to be dismantled. It needs to be transformed into something more peaceful, and something where the incentives align around actual security and not around the growth of power. But that's not how it works. It feeds on our fear. It feeds on its own centralization. It's about mission creep. And then when it gets back into the justificatory strike zone, we have to say, well, shit, that's all we've got. So it grows and grows some more. Empire grows, but we're running out of money, dude. We're running out of money.
Running
It's going
out.
to collapse in on
We're
itself pretty
33
soon.
trillion in debt. We're been out of money. All right. Max, where can the people find you?
You can read my asymptotic anarchism and my political nihilism at underthrow.org.
Awesome. Max, thanks for a great discussion, especially because we freewheeled it ad hoc. That was great.
Oh, it was
All
a
right.
blast.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Remember, let me know what you think. Until next time.